Manana Sidhu Samsu Todo. Can you say that with me? Manana Sidzuas. That is one of our greetings, and it calls on the light of the dawn to enlighten us, to bless us, to give us wisdom. So I would like to share with you some ways that Guam, that the Chamorro people of Guam, the indigenous people, we call ourselves Taotao Tåno. And we're very much connected with our ancestral wisdom in the ways that we perform, in the ways that we chant, in the ways that we talk. But because of our history of colonization, we're very much disconnected in terms of our educational system, in terms of our consciousness about what is possible. Most of you know, if you have come from an island setting that has experienced colonization of any kind, that the effects of colonization are sometimes hard to undo in 1 or 2 generations, right? So we're trying very hard to claim cultural sovereignty. We may not have political sovereignty on Guam. We are a colony of the United States. We may not have economic sovereignty because we cannot negotiate our economic relationships with other countries, but no one can take away our cultural sovereignty. Mañana, Saina is a title that we give to not just people who are old, but people who guide, people who provide wisdom to younger generations. I grew up at a time when it was against policy to speak a word of Chamorro. So when we were in school, we were fined. We were required to pay money if we said Chamorro words. 25 cents in the 1950s is a heavy price to pay for speaking your own language. But that was the penalty we had to pay. Parents were told that if they wanted their children to succeed in school and succeed in the economy, and the wage economy was introduced on Guam, parents were told, in order for you to do better for your children, you have to speak to them in English, even if your English is broken. So 3 generations of Chamorros have been disconnected from our language. Many young people have taken on the responsibility of learning our language as adults. Fortunately for me, when I was growing up, we were reared by my grandmother and her sisters, and none of them spoke English. So that was a great gift to us because they only spoke to us in Chamorro, and so we were able to learn and speak Chamorro. But when I was growing up, I never took a single course in Chamorro. I never took a course in college in Chamorro. The only time I sat in a Chamorro class was when I was asked to teach the first Chamorro course offered at the University of Hawaii. Can you imagine that? I was asked to teach a course for which I had no teaching preparation because I had never taught Chamorro before. I'd never taken a course in Chamorro before. But I stayed 1 chapter ahead of my students. And that's how I was able to manage. And now, of course, myself and others like me are viewed as the mañana of this whole language revitalization movement. I never took a course in history of Guam until I started teaching history of Guam at the University of Guam. Things have changed dramatically. And the generations younger than myself have had the benefit of at least taking 1 Guam history course in high school maybe, and Chamorro for 20 minutes a day. That's my pet peeve, 20 minutes a day when they were in elementary school and maybe in high school. So things are not the way they should be, but we're moving in the right direction, and I'll share a little bit of how we're doing that to help preserve, maintain, and grow our Chamorro language. Guam history is not the same as Chamorro history. Hopefully you'll be able to visit the Guam Museum and you'll be able to see some of what I'm talking about. Why Guam history and Chamorro history are not equal. Chamorro history is the history of the indigenous people called Taotao Tåno. Can you say that? Taotao Tåno. That's what we call ourselves, the people of this land. Because we learned that these 14 islands in the archipelago are called the Mariana Islands. But the Mariana Islands were named by a missionary in 1668. Our ancestors made this their homeland thousands of years before that. But we had colonial amnesia. With colonization, the first thing you do is you convince people that everything that their culture represented in the past is irrelevant to their future. That's how Chamorros grew up. We were socialized that way. And so we didn't even know the names of our islands. So when you refer to the Mariana Islands, in the indigenous way, we call our islands Itanu Lagwas, Zangani. And those are the 14 islands. Each island has a Chamorro name, but the names that appear in the maps are not indigenous names. They're the names that were written in accounts of the first explorers and then cartographers that followed them. One of the businesses of the Comisión Finit Chamorro is to restore and rename, not to change the name, but to begin to use the indigenous names for places. Guam history is the history of this geographic place. Not the history of people, but the history of what happened in this geographic place. So we make that distinction. So it is largely a colonial history written by colonial operatives, but we are reclaiming the telling of our history. And we begin with the chant that invites our ancestors to share their wisdom with us. This chant talks about several things which I'll bring out to you later on. These are unfamiliar to the teaching of Guam history, but central to the teaching of Chamorro history.
Guai fi ikula mahanyana Taotao mahami Ogeni Taotao mahami Mohamed Gudi Talen mahami Med Gudi Talen mahami Taotao mahami Ogeni Taotao mahami Mohamed Gudi Talen mahami Med Gudi Talen mahami Wahafi ikula mahami Ikula Jahan kwa pi ikula mahami. Ikula mahami. Ho! Ho!
Believe it or not, chants like this, dances like this were forbidden. They were outlawed. So until the last few decades, we were not allowed to do this. And so there's been a lot of revitalization of performance and art. Thank God for that. Because we have a lot of talent. But there's always the question, how do we know that that's authentic? For colonized people, the issue of authenticity, of validation is a big issue. And our young people, people who have talent, struggle and they get discouraged when they're told or when they're asked, how do you know that our ancestors danced that? My response is this: if you're doing it and you're Chamorro, it's authentic. It's an expression, it's a cultural expression of who you are. And that defines authenticity. But the debate is still out there because I often argue with many who are my contemporaries who have power of decision about this issue of authenticity and validation. But a lot of young people who are chanters and performers, dancers, also do a tremendous amount of research. And the written record, as even though they are colonial accounts, they're very descriptive about what people observed when they first came here. We have a lot of explorers who stopped by and wrote copious notes about what they saw because it was so different from what their cultures had. In that way, a lot of young people have tried to recreate what may have been the performing expressions, cultural expressions of the time. We begin with the kulu. What is the kulu? The kulu is the trumpet shell. It is the signature of most island cultures. Trumpet shell is also a symbol of calling people together. It's the symbol of dinanya, CHamoru. It's the symbol of alerting our people that something is happening. So these dancers are urging the call of the kulu. They are alerting our people that something important is happening or that we need to pay attention to something. So it's kind of like an alarm bell or a church bell, you know, like that kind of thing. It's a way of signaling a call to action. So the kulu is a very strong representation in our cultural expression today as we try to revitalize our culture. Måta is another important thing. Now, if you notice, a lot of the languages in the Pacific use something similar to måta, right? However way we say it, that is what ties us together. Our indigenous wisdom, our indigenous knowledge, the knowledge of our ancestors. Because remember, our ancestors were all connected before we began to be separated, right? We were all connected and we were all tied to what is now the nation of Taiwan. Through the Nisanto Trade Network and the great explorations 5,000 years ago, our people began to spread out and eventually venture into the island Pacific. But we all have common roots, and that's evident in our language, that's evident in some of our cultural expression. And you know, when the indigenous people of Taiwan came for FESPAC in 2016, Chamorros were fascinated that we shared a lot of the same kinds of music instruments, for example, like the bulembao patsut, the whistle, right, the flute, or the bulembao tudzan, the rumbling belly instrument, string instrument. And yet we had no knowledge of each other. prior to these global opportunities that bring us together. The Festival of Pacific Arts brings island communities together in a way that nothing else does, really, culturally speaking. So when I started going to FESPAC, we were viewed, Chamorros were viewed as copycatters of all other island ways of celebrating. But eventually we began to develop our own expressions. And I think that the symbol of Chamorro being has changed in the consciousness of other Pacific Islanders. The måta connects us all, right? The måta connects us all, but it also connects us to our ancestral insights. The Australian Aborigines, when I was in Townsville, engaged us in a very deep, digging in kind of experience to help us to find our måta, and they call that the dreaming. When you surrender your Western consciousness to an indigenous consciousness, you begin to be aware of, hear things, see things, understand things in a different way. So we're encouraging our young people now to tap into our ancestral måta. We are able through our måta to see things which are not visible to the eye. That is the logo of the Komisioni Finot Chamorro. Because what we do is we are guiding nation building by deep digging into that måta. So that's the symbol of the Komision's logo. You've heard me say it, you've heard the chanters call it. Mañana is the word for our ancestors, our elders, our ancestors. The wise and ancient first people, the Taotao Tåno, from whom we descend. Talin mamini met gut. Our ties are strong, she's calling out. We are connected. We're not disconnected. And for Guam, because we are a matrilineal society, we are connected through our uterine line. And that connection, my dear friends, is the most primal of all connections. The uterine line connection, the umbilical cord, is our tie to our ancestors. And that is what she's calling out to remind everybody about in the chant, Italin Mañanata. So we must not be afraid to venture into our ancestral måta. Many Chamorros are afraid yet, because of insecurities brought on by our colonial mindset. Slowly, we're developing the courage. And pretty soon, the young people, if you talk to young Chamorros, little kids, they are ready to champion the cause for their reshaped identity. And that's so very important. I want to talk to you a little bit about Indigenous revisionism. Because history, the way it is written, the way it has been written, is a history that records the events and the doings of people who came to Guam, not of the people of Guam. And so in order for us to fill in the blanks, really, to fill in the big gaps that exist, we have needed to move in the direction of reclaiming that history, reinterpreting history, rewriting history to centralize Chamorros in that story. So that's what revisionist historiography is all about. Why challenge conventional historiography? To you young people, this may not mean a lot, but to my generation, if it was written, it was like the Bible in terms of its stature, right? You don't mess with it. You don't question it. And if you do, you're considered outside the box. Today, you young people love to play outside the box, thank God. It's outside the box that we can really come into touch with a reality that has not yet been captured in the way that history is taught on Guam even today. Conventional historiography is incomplete. It's an exclusive portrayal. It leaves out the experience of ordinary people. It's also elitist and sexist. It's about great men and the great deeds that they did. So Guam history was Magellan, Legazpi, San Vitores, the chiefs who fought, like Kepuha and Hurao and Hirao and Aguigan. And then we go to the governors, to American governors and naval officers and things like that. Only now are we naming our schools after educators, CHamoru educators. That wasn't always the case. If you go around the island, in Agutnia, for example, our capital, you'll see the street called Hernan Cortez. I mean, he was a freaking conquistador, and we have a street named after him. Well, what is wrong with that picture? And yet we honor them with grandiose names. So we're working on that, okay? But it's going to take a long time because people get stuck on stuff. So there's all kinds of contradictions that are difficult to deal with. And we can't trivialize them because people have reasons for attachments, right? So we just have to help them to get unattached in a way that makes sense. And that's not always easy when you're raging with anger or when you're, really pissed off about it. And so these are difficult things to do, but this is the kind of work that we're doing now. Conventional history assumes one interpretation of historical events is the most factual or authentic because it has written documentation to back it up. Because who were the writers of history? Those who were preserving conventional colonial history. Again, you see the challenge that we have as we try to unpack and rewrite CHamoru history from our perspective. The goal of Indigenous historiography, or CHamoru revisionism, is to redirect our historical narrative, place ourselves and our ancestors as the primary actors in our collective historical experience. And you'll note in the Guam Museum that we've really tried conscientiously to do that. In other words, it is the telling of our story and ethos by Indigenous storytellers using our cultural insights, our måta. This doesn't mean that we throw out all those historical records that have been kept to what our ancestors did, what they felt was important, what they fought for, and how they were different from the people who were coming into our homeland. We cannot just throw them out. But being CHamoru doesn't mean being backward. And that's the impression we have to correct. But it means owning your identity and celebrating it in the ways that make us feel good and express to ourselves and to others who we are. So who are these writers of our history? The missionaries. They loved to write. And initially, they were not jaded in their perspective until they started making judgments about what our ancestors were doing and not doing. So a lot of those early accounts were wonderful descriptions of dance, of song, of dress or lack of dress, of activities. Lots of beautiful descriptions. These historical records are invaluable to our reconstructing and reinterpreting cultural practice and events for which we have no living memory. Remember, if one of the ways of subduing a people is to divide and conquer people, people are divided, they're alienated from their own way of knowing. That way of knowing becomes delegitimized. And so in order to restore that, you've got to do a lot of work. And it's intergenerational. It's not going to happen overnight. We've begun the work in this generation, but it's going to take 2 or 3 generations to change that mindset. So creating culturally informed interpretation builds on fact, not fiction. A lot of people think that, we're just dreaming this stuff up, and that it's fictional. Knowledge comes down through the generations, through language. So what is the biggest repository of our knowledge from our ancestors? The biggest repository is the Chamorro language. And it reveals in so many different ways what our ancestors were thinking, what they named, what is important to them, and how they viewed the world. It's embedded in our language. So when people say, how do you know that's true? Why would they have created spoken word about it if it weren't true? So that's our fact. And believe it or not, a lot of people are not comfortable making that claim. Why? Because they don't know the language. And if you don't know the language, you can't use it as your source of, as your font of wisdom, so to speak. So we are encouraging young people in every way they can not to pay attention to the ridicule, not to pay attention to, there's a lot of teasing. Chamorros are very budlon. They love to tease. So if young people are trying to speak and they're massacring the accent or their pronunciation or the construction of the sentence, they get ridiculed. And what happens? Very quickly, they stop speaking. They stop trying, right? So we're trying to tell speakers of Chamorro, please control yourselves, be gentle, tolerate error, because you made so many errors when you were learning the language yourself. And so why are we penalizing our young people for doing what is the most natural thing in the world to do when you're learning any language? Make mistakes. That's how you learn. But we don't have that tolerance. So that is one of the biggest obstacles, intergenerational obstacles that we're trying to overcome. Our language is called Finu Hadza, and Hadza points to where? To the Philippines, to Taiwan. That's Hadza. So our source of wisdom comes from the West, right? But Hadza is our West. That's how we describe the origin of our language. All of us, all of you, I would wager, are engaged in indigenous revisionism. Because as we begin to change interpretations, we begin to change naming practice, we begin to declare different perspectives, we are engaged in indigenous revisionism. Now let's look at Guam history. The conventional historic periods that are talked about if you take a course, or if you took a course 20 years ago, say, at the University of Guam, you would have gotten these historic periods. Anthropologists use these historic periods. Archaeologists. The common knowledge that circulates in the community is based on this periodization, okay? There's the pre-contact era. Now, history with the West is 500 years old, okay, on Guam. Pre-contact history, which is relegated to one period, spans 3,500 years or more. So right then and there, there's a lot of unevenness, right? There's a lot of weight given to recorded colonial history, but very little weight given to what happened prior to colonization. So we're trying to fill in that huge gap of 3,500 years. Now, anthropologists and archaeologists, as you know, are very helpful in this regard, right? Because they tell us about settlements, they tell us about burials, about the life that existed at a particular period of time, when people came, in what waves they came, and so on and so forth. But we know from archaeology on Guam that first Chamorros, if you will, the first Taotao Tåno came and settled permanently on this island about 4,000 years ago. And they came from the West. And that's what connects us with Austronesia, with this group of Austronesian speaking peoples, of which we are all a part. There is no Austronesia. It's a scientific term used to describe those languages that are connected to an ancestral language. And that language is said to have originated from the indigenous peoples of Taiwan. It is great to have you, descendants of our ancestors, in our midst today. So thank you. And our ancestors bless you for that. Then there's the Spanish colonial era, which extended from the earliest official visit was by Magellan in 1521. So many kids, if you speak with them in school, you ask them, when did history begin? And they will give you the date, 1521, because that's when Magellan came. We used to celebrate as our Discovery Day, the March 6th, which is the day that Magellan was supposed to have landed in Måta, right? So March 6th used to be quote unquote Discovery Day. And then it became Magellan Day. Then it became Guam History Day. Today it is called CHamoru Culture Day. Okay, so you can see the evolution even in naming, right? That reflects a different kind of consciousness. But the Spanish colonial era lasted from that fateful visit in 1521 and ended in 1898 when Spain lost the Spanish-American War that occurred thousands of miles away from Guam shores, but Guam was given as a spoils of the Spanish-American War to the United States in 1898. Thus began the early American naval era. So Guam was claimed by a naval governor, Leary. He was sent here. He was very hesitant to come on shore, actually. His lieutenant governor came on shore and established an office operation. Leary stayed on the ship, eventually came on shore, but that was the first naval governor of Guam. And ever since, up until the Second World War, there were naval governors appointed. And they treated Guam as a kind of ship, as a battleship, if you will. And they ruled as captains of the ship. And so they promulgated lots of regulations. For example, they didn't like the slippers that were clacking on the sidewalks as Chamorro women would go to mass early in the morning. So they prohibited the wearing of those slippers. One of the wives of the naval governors didn't like that people whistled a lot, so they prohibited whistling. They also prohibited the use of the Chamorro language. They prohibited so many things and forced people to live in certain ways. This began with the Spanish period, continued in the American period, so that the ways of our ancestors became vague memory and something that wasn't really important to document. Then you have the Japanese occupation. The Japanese on Guam were here for only 4 years. But that is the most well-remembered part of our past by our elders, because they were subjugated to great brutalities during the Japanese occupation. And so if you think about history, very often elders will think about they name history before the war and after the war. And that's the war they're talking about. But almost everybody lived in Agana, lived in Hagatna, which is the capital, and then had their farms or their lansu, their gualo outside of Hagatna. That was before the war. After the war, the United States, in taking over Guam, bombed the living daylights out of Hagatna and just flattened it. In a short period of time, hundreds and thousands of years of history were erased. So the ruins that you see in Hagatna are what withstood the bombing. Then there's the post-war American era. The era that is attributed to our formation as American citizens until the time that we were able to elect our own governor in 1970. And then Guamanian contemporary era is the periodization that describes our life today. The term Guamanian, it's a post-Second World War term. When schools were reestablished, people wanted to get as far away from Japanese identity as possible. So to use ease, like Japanese, right, was something that people wanted to avoid. So they had a contest in one of the high schools, and the students were encouraged to provide alternate names to call the residents of Guam. And the term Guamanian won in that contest. Guamanian is not synonymous with Chamorro. It used to be, because almost everyone living on Guam during the war and right after the war were Chamorro. But that picture really quickly changed. And so Guamanian is now used to refer to the residents of Guam. Chamorros are 42% of the current population, so we are a shrinking majority. But whether you're Chamorro or not, you can still be Guamanian if you're a resident of Guam, right? And there are more Chamorros living in the diaspora than there are here on Guam. And that's the same for Guam as well as for the other Norte Mariana Islands as well. So there are more Chamorros living in the diaspora, most of them in the United States, but not all, right? Some of them are in Europe, some of them are in Asia, in other countries. But for the most part, the numbers of Chamorros in the world is decreasing in the homeland and increasing everywhere else. A group of us, when we were asked to participate in shaping the story that would go into the Guam Museum, we were asked what periodization we wanted to use. And we decided we would rename periodization. Now, there had been bubblings, you know. The Department of Parks and Recreation, the Guam historian, had been suggesting the Historic Preservation Unit of the Department of Parks and Recreation had been suggesting that we change the periodization to reflect more our story. But it was never formally done until we did it with the Guam exhibit. We made another decision, and that decision was to think of the periods first in Chamorro and then to translate them into English. Narrative in Chamorro and then tell the equivalent in English rather than the other way around, okay? That makes a difference. If you're working in your language, you know that when we say something in our language, it is substantially and spiritually different than if we say the same thing in English. That's one of the distinctions. But you'll notice in the conventional historiography, you have dates like 1521, Magellan stopover, 1665. Legazpi claims the islands for the Spanish crown. 1668, the establishment of the mission and the colony, the formal colony. 1680 to 1710, what are called the Spanish Chamorro Wars. There were no wars per se, but there were skirmishes and there was rebellion and conflict, right? So they called those the wars. And then 1898, the Spanish-American War, when Guam was transferred to the US as part of spoils of war, okay? People here in Guam had no idea that the Spanish-American War was taking place until Captain Glass arrived on our shores and claimed the island for the United States and raised a different flag. Even the Spanish governor here was totally unaware that there was a war being fought that would impact the colony, okay? So then we transition into the American colonial period, 1898 with the takeover, introduction of wage-based economy, Americanization of locals, 1941, Guam enters World War II. US personnel evacuate, and that begins another phase in our history called the Japanese occupation, which took place from 1941 to 1944. Japan forces bomb and occupy Guam at the same time that they were bombing Pearl Harbor. They were bombing Guam. They were bombing Hagåtña, but because we are a day ahead, the story will ever be known that Pearl Harbor was the first to be bombed on December 7, and then Guam was bombed on December 8, but it was the same time period. They did simultaneous attack. And then the Japanese surrender to the US Marines, who liberate Guam from brutal occupation. Okay, so you then have July 21st being celebrated as Liberation Day. We still are very, conflicted about what to call that day sometimes. If you have a little bit of a consciousness, it just doesn't feel good to call that Liberation Day when you're not liberated, but rather just occupied by a more benevolent occupier, right? Nonetheless, it is an occupation. We're still a colony, and our people have a very difficult time acknowledging our colonial status in that respect. Then the next phase is the phase we're in now, which is American. We are an American territory. We're an unincorporated territory. And the U.S. establishes military, then civilian control. Residents acquire U.S. citizenship in 1950. So we are all American citizens. Now that complicates our journey even further because we are colonials. Our citizenship was granted by the U.S. Congress and can be taken away by the U.S. Congress. Not all of the constitutional privileges of the U.S. Constitution apply to Guam citizens. So there's all kinds of weird stuff going on, but we are second-class American citizens. Nonetheless, we have American passports. We've been given the right to elect our own governor. We exercised that right in 1970, but we are still under U.S. control as part of territorial jurisdiction. And there's very few things that we really have control over. Our governor and our legislature, they do have control over internal affairs, but we do not control our borders. We do not control our economic relationships, and we definitely do not control how our land is used for defense. That's where we stand. Now that's the traditional picture. That's the conventional historiographic flow in a nutshell. History from the perspective of that 16th century startup, it becomes a very different history than when we look at history as a 4,000-year-old experience of a people. The storyline of the Chamorro people is hidden in plain sight. Never stop asking the questions. No question is ever crazy or silly, because it's the only way that we can begin to look at reality through a different lens. There have been some efforts. Early on, there were efforts, some of us were writing 30, 40 years ago, and we began to challenge conventional historiography, but this is not the mainstream, okay? This is not what's being taught in our schools. It's not the core of how we teach our own history. I wrote Daughters of the Island, which became the first monograph series. I didn't realize that I was the first Chamorro woman to publish a book until I was honored by the Guam Women's Chamber of Commerce not too long ago. Now you might notice the depiction on the cover is a child's drawing. It's the cycle of life storytelling tradition that was depicted in the earliest records describing Chamorros and how they told stories. And it was the woman who was always at the center of the storytelling experience. So we tried to create that. I told my little nieces, my sister's daughters, they were both 9 years old, and I told them the story about the circle of life and about storytelling. And the two of them went and drew this picture for me and brought it to me and said, "Can you make this the cover of your book?" And how could I say no, right? And I've been criticized for doing this, but that's how intergenerational connection about history is really the most important way to share history. They're both grown women today, nearly 50, and they still tell their children about how their drawing became part of the cover of my book. Melia Ramirez is our Guam historian, okay, our official Guam historian, and she has written a book called La Sangre Llama, which is about the genealogy of Chamorro families. The blood calls. She used the word sangre llama, which is a Spanish term. There are others. There's a whole series of books called the Haleta series. So while these books are available, teachers are not using them actively in the classroom. It's a very sad story. There's also a whole series that were produced in Tinian by Don Farrell, and this is one of them, the Mariana Islands and Partition. Recently, there has been a big effort to document the stories of war survivors because they were dying. You know, COVID, lots of our war survivors have passed away since COVID. And so there have been 3 volumes produced so far. One of them is Families in the Face of Survival. And the elders are telling their stories. Their grandchildren, their children are writing those stories. There's another book, We Drank Our Tears, which was a project in the Northern Marianas that has been translated into multiple languages now. And it's grandchildren interviewing their grandparents about the war years. And they actually wrote and illustrated the book themselves, the kids. The social reconstruction of reality, you know, when Samuel came to Guam almost 50 years ago, my husband, he came with ideas that shook us at our foundations because we didn't know that we were a colony. We never called ourselves a colony. We didn't really know how to articulate the discontent that we were feeling. Many of us had just come back from college. We were exposed to a lot of great ideas in college, right? But we didn't know how to interface that with the discourse here on Guam.
You have to reconstruct the way you have been defined as a people so that the accurate image of who you truly are controls the narrative of Chamorro history. The cultural lenses used to view yourselves as the Taotao Tåno needs to reject images that portray your ancestors as thieves, ladrones, or simple-minded. You come from a great line of navigators who traverse uncharted seas in search of a homeland. They brought technical knowledge, a unique language, and survival skills that have persisted to this day. You are much more than what has been written by outsiders who sought to justify themselves as superior for the purposes of control. To internalize their view of who you are inflicts doubt and creates an inferior social status. You have to reject that rejection through the social construction of your reality.
And he came in at a pivotal time. We weren't married at the time, but he came in at a pivotal time to introduce us to a consciousness. You know, Paulo Freire, if any of you are familiar with his work, Concientización, Samuel had worked with Paulo Freire and had translated for him at Harvard because Sammy came out of Harvard. He brought a paradigm shift in our consciousness. and helped us to articulate what is called, what he phrased as the social reconstruction of reality, and began to teach us how we could do that. And so a whole generation of us became fully engaged in that process in the 70s and 80s. And we are now known in history as the Chamorro generation, because we decided to begin to take back our identity as Chamorros and to rewrite history as much as we could. So the Guam Museum really is the living testament of this departure from conventional historiography. But it gives you a feeling that something's different, that something's changed, because the main actors in the story are different. So when you enter as if you were the navigators that entered into this land, right? And so that's the whole experience that you're led through. And so it really tries to evoke a different sense of history than the history that our children have been introduced to. And I think that for that reason, it's really a singular expression of the new definition, the revisionist definition of history. The exhibit itself is called Hinanao Nui Taotao Tåno CHamoru. So this is our journey, not what happened to Guam, but what has happened in the Chamorro experience, right? Looking at culture and social organization of the first people through this lens then becomes a totally different experience. So I invite you to go back to the Guam Museum if you get a chance and look at it through the lens that I've shared with you today and see if you see things differently or hear things differently.